back to the Biblical Preaching Podcast, and we are going to think about the subject we've called this episode "Land It."
Yes.
Yes. So why have we called it that? Because when you have a message, you study the passage, you get to grips with what it means, you understand it, very much a sort of back then focus. What did the author mean when he wrote to those people and so on? But then you bring that across. A lot of people talk about the bridge, bringing it across a bridge to a contemporary world and then land the message for your listeners. And that's kind of what we want to focus on. Okay, so that the same text, the same sermon, the same shape, outline, maybe mostly the same illustrations, but with a different audience, still there's something that needs to change. And it's not the message, it's not the text, it's how you land it.
Yeah, that's really important to, I think, underline, is that we're not saying in any of this that the audience changes the meaning. The meaning of the text is the intended meaning of the text, but how that is communicated, how that is shared, how that's received, even, I think is important to say. Yeah, how is it landed in the room that you are preaching? And we're thinking about it, or I was thinking about it, preaching in different places, in home church, in other contexts, and just thinking out how, like, it does take work, and it should take work, to land what I'm preaching to the people in the room. And I think then you notice when there's occasions when you're hearing other preaching and it doesn't seem to be landing, it's maybe wonder, well, what is it that's kind of not gripping me? And it might be me, it might be my problem. But I think but in general, that seems to be quite a common issue, I think, for preachers.
Yeah, and I think that the point of connection, there's a couple of different ones, because I'm sure that I've preached the same message in different places, largely the same. But I wonder if that's been partially because it's not getting into, it's one of those messages that's sort of stirring hearts to worship God for who he is, rather than this is what this text does for the way you live your life. Those kind of messages feel like they need to be even more adjusted. But I think so. You've got the whole issue of application, right? And so how you apply the message needs to be targeted to the people in front of you at some level. But then there's other bits. There's sort of incidental bits in the message, passing references. And so that's why we talked about this before on an episode. When you're a visiting speaker, getting to know, even in the 20 minutes before the meeting starts, asking questions and finding out who constitutes that church.
Yeah, so if there are a lot of teachers, then using language of the classroom, or actually, I think more helpfully, using language of the staff room. I think that typically is the place where faith of teachers gets kind of rubbed up against, is in the staff room. Very competitive, sometimes nasty. So if you know there are teachers, then being able to talk about sometimes in the staff room. If you know that there are that there is a particular industry, or if there's a lot of retired people, then you sort of like you say, not just we're not just kind of applying it to retired people at the end of the message, but all the way through. How are you using your time in your week if you're retired, and maybe the difficulties of transition from work to being retired, and how kind of Jesus works in that transition. Yeah, they're sort of, they're not throwaway comments, but they're sort of, what do you call them, incidental kind of comments, and just being as aware as you can.
And just to be clear, there's no, probably, there may be an exception to this, but generally speaking, there isn't one employer per church. So it's not like, sure, you have a church where absolutely everybody works in education and another church where absolutely everybody works in a hospital. But typically there will be one that's stronger in a congregation. A rural congregation might be more farm oriented, but might not. You need to know, you need to ask. In a suburban or an urban setting, it may be more office work, it may be more retail. If you've got a large population of students, that's different than if you don't. And so being sensitive to what makes up the congregation in front of you allows you to make incidental but specific remarks as you go. And so if it is a high, let's say, education church, lots of teachers, assistants, people that work in the school office, that sort of thing, then referencing the staff room connects with them, but it doesn't fail to connect with someone who works in a hospital or works in an office, because when they hear staff room, they'll think coffee machine or wherever they meet, or encounter other employees. And so it's much better to be specific. And if you can be specific for a majority group or a larger minority group, if you like, and then the others, the kind of the one-offs in their setting, will translate what they hear. But that's much better than saying a generic passing reference to say, the place at work where you rub shoulders with others. That's so vague.
Yeah.
Just say something specific and let people translate it to their own setting.
Yeah. And I think, so that those things are true in kind of when you're guest preaching, and we do a fair share of that. And as you said, there's an episode where we talk about that. But it's most of our preaching, so your preaching would be in sort of home turf in our church. And I wonder if there's perhaps kind of similar temptations. So kind of one temptation is, apart from get, you're preaching in our church and you pretty much know everyone that is listening in the room.
Or at least I'm aware of what's going on. Yeah.
And certainly very aware of sort of underneath situations. I wonder if could be a temptation to, there's so many everyone's different people in the room, so the temptation is to go generic because you kind of don't want to miss people. But then I wonder if another temptation or challenge is to be almost overly specific.
Yeah.
So, in this application point, I'm preaching to you, Mike, and this is for you. And that situation you told me about the other day? Well, that is for you. And this next one, that's for you, Sarah or Dave. You can go really vague and so lose people, and then really specific and lose people.
And upset people.
And you're absolutely right. So for you, sort of kind of like as an elder, like we said, you're aware of people in the room, you know a lot more about individuals in the room than anyone else would. Kind of how do you go about thinking through, well, I'm applying specific things and general things to the people in, how do you go about that?
I think you need to be just recognizing that the balance that you want to be sensitive. I think being sensitive to the group as a whole, and then being sensitive to individuals within it. So if something you're going to say could work really well for the group as a whole, but really be problematic for an individual family, it's best to spot that ahead of time. And I've missed that. I've said something that was ideal for the church as a whole, and then afterwards discovered that one family found that really hard to take and had to apologize and say, I'm sorry, I didn't think that through. And they were very gracious, and that. So mistakes happen. But the danger is where, I think the ultimate danger is where you're targeting individual and everyone else knows who you're targeting.
Okay, yeah.
So, for example, in our church, if I refer to struggles in marriage, there's no one that's going to say he's just talking about us, because there's quite a number of couples that would be quite open about, marriage is hard work and we're working on it and we're getting help, and that's great. It's hopefully a more transparent congregation than some. But in a church where every marriage looks perfect, like Instagram perfect, and everybody knows that couple are heading towards a divorce, and it's awkward and everybody knows it, that's not the time to say something that's going to sort of hit home with them. If you've got something that's really on target for a crisis situation, go to them. Don't preach it at them, because everyone in the room knows, oh, you're talking about them. Oh, interesting. Oh, I wonder how they're taking this, And so that can be awkward. Now, there's times where I've preached something and I'm conscious that there's one person in the room that really needs to hear this, but I'm fairly sure that no one knows who I'm thinking of. And so in that situation, I'm more bold, more willing to go for it a little bit. I tend to be careful with eye contact, because you can give it away if you're staring at them at that moment.
And a good point, probably, as well.
Exactly.
Maybe not.
But yeah, I think you do need to be sensitive and be careful, but don't be so careful that you never touch issues that people are wrestling with. Otherwise, they think you're not preaching to us.
Yeah, and because we want people to be, when people sometimes come away from a message and say it's like you were talking directly to me.
Yeah,
that's kind of what you want, and that tends to happen when I'm not.
Yeah,
particularly talking directly to you.
Usually, if they're saying that, and you were,
yeah,
it's the start of a conversation.
Yeah, and it's
that's
not
awkward.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like you don't want people thinking they're talking about you in that sense, but you want people to think, actually, yeah, this is God's word for me, and it was like you knew more than you know, and so like how you're doing that with sensitivity, and that would. Again, perhaps more of a challenge for you because you in our church you would know things that are specific that I wouldn't if I'm preaching.
Right. Yeah, you're able to kind of proclaim into a congregation you're generally aware of.
Yeah.
And there's people in your life group you're more aware of, and friends that you're more aware of, but you're not maybe hearing about some of the crisis things. And so if you touch on a crisis thing, it's okay.
Yeah.
It doesn't ruffle feathers. If I sound like I'm really targeting a crisis situation, it does feel awkward. And generally, I think, it's, like I said, it's better if it's really targeted. It's better to go one-on-one with that person.
Yeah, exactly.
But targeted to the congregation as a whole, I think that's really critical. That's the blessing of having a person in the room preaching at you or to you, because people will sometimes preachers will feel inadequate. They'll say, well, my congregation's listening to this person and this person and this person on a podcast, and how am I supposed to compete with them? And I'll always say, but you're in the room. John Piper or John MacArthur or whoever they name, Francis Chan, doesn't matter, whoever their named people are, those people are preaching to a different group somewhere else, and their communication may be excellent, their Bible handling may be awesome. Whatever you think, that's fine, but you're in the room and you know them. And that there's something unique about that. And so it would be a shame to be in the room and know the people and then preach vague and generic, So having a sense of there's a lot of new Christians or not yet Christians in the room. I want to make sure I explain the basics. I want to keep this at an accessible level. Nobody's offended by that, even if they've been a Christian 60 years, because they also know that there's a lot of new people in the room. Do you see what I mean? So having a sensitivity to the people in front of you and landing it for them, I think has to be a good thing.
Yeah, and it's one of the ways that certainly you and the other elders of the church pastor, like it's. I think we said this on another episode before, but kind of preaching as pastoring is kind of how it should be. Like it's the value of, when I'm hearing you preach, it's not like it's both. Well, you know me, but I know you.
Yeah,
and that connection of preaching and listening to preaching when you're in the room, and that's maybe just as an aside. Perhaps that's an interesting thing to say is a lot of people's services or messages are live streamed and are actually recorded and shared, and it can be tempting to preach to the people listening across assuming that you have that kind of reach, but actually I'm aware that we're recording the church service and recording the message, and I'm aware that actually there are church members watching because they're away or because they can't come, and so kind of that's an awareness too, actually. But I'm trying not to think, well, someone might be watching this in Brazil, so I need to, preach to them. Like that's a slightly crazy example, but like,
well, yeah, I mean, we've had people,
you
not large numbers, but we've had people watching from time zones away who just want to watch, and that's fine. They're welcome to watch, but they're watching what we're doing in the room.
Yeah.
Rather than, I have been in churches where it feels like the congregation is the studio audience, but the action is happening to the camera. And that just feels backwards to me.
Yeah.
I think the people watching online are the audience, if you like. The people in the room are the congregation.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to keep that the right way around. So yeah, if you're not well and you're watching from your hospital bed, I'm preaching to you.
Yeah.
You know, because I know you and you're part of it. But if somebody happens to tune in every week or whatever the phrase is, they get to benefit, and I'm glad. But I'm not targeting my message in any way to somebody who's on a different continent.
I guess in this whole process, or this part of that sort of sermon message preparation process, it's quite a long-term thing to be doing, isn't it? It's especially in your own church, because you're always meeting with people, talking with people, knowing people. One of my old pastors from a different church used to spend time with individuals in their workplace, so where it was appropriate. He would go and visit, for a morning or for a couple of hours, or even just for a lunch break, some of our workplaces, just to see what it was like. And so, and the reason, there was a pastoral kind of care relationship there too, but it was to see, well, okay, what is it like in this person's break room, in their kind of office? What's the feel, what's the vibe? And so then when he's preaching and applying truth, they just sort of know how to land it, and again, know how to land the applications to the people that are in the room listening.
Yeah. I was just thinking of a couple of examples of that. Even as a guest speaker, it's possible to land it, because I think sometimes it's the guest speaker or the conference speaker that feels the most generic. Do you know what I mean? The most canned, if that's a word to use. It may not be, but it can feel that way. But just a couple of examples. So there's a guy who does quite a number of funerals in our area, so in this part of the country, and people could even guess who I mean. But I've heard him 3 times, I think, at funerals. And I think I've heard him 3 times preach the same message at funerals, which sounds like a negative, but actually it's an ideal message. It's great, but they're so personalized.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of it, is if you listen to all 3 of them back to back, you'd go, oh, wow, they're substantially the same, but there's so much personal story and anecdote and connection points with the deceased, with the family members, and his own connection with them in the past. So you couldn't come into that and think, oh, he's just being paid to do this.
Yeah, because the truth and comfort of Jesus in the gospel, the reality is that is the same it's the same truth, the same comfort to everybody. But in communication and how that, like you said, how that lands on a day of a funeral or a day of a wedding or whatever, just a normal Sunday, that's different for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in terms of conference, the example that always comes to mind from me is John Lennox at the European Leadership Forum. So I heard John Lennox, probably 15, 18 years before, when I was a youth myself. And he came to a youth missions type weekend. He was the main speaker, and he spoke on Daniel, and excellent. And I just remember the impact, and it was one of those significant moments in my life, and I'm really grateful for that. But then I heard him at the European Leadership Forum in 2012 when he did Daniel. And he's in a room with hundreds of people who are leaders, pastors, scientists, PhDs. It was a completely different crowd than the 17-year-olds that I was with back in the day. And he preached very similar material, because Daniel hasn't changed. Hopefully his own study of it has continued to deepen, of course, but essentially, a 55-year-old John Lennox and a 75-year-old John Lennox may not be that different on his understanding of Daniel, but his targeting for the people in front of him was just stunning. And I remember sitting there thinking, this is masterful, because you could tell as he's going, he's speaking to academics, he's speaking to Christian thought leaders, he's speaking to people who have influence, who face pushback at the highest levels, who are involved in university debates. And do you know what I mean? It was masterful, because it was the same Daniel, it was the same truth, but it was pitched and kind of presented in a way that just left that room. I remember on the last day as he finished, normally everyone just stands up and leaves. Nobody moved.
Wow.
You could just hear a pin drop, but nobody wanted to leave that room. It was something, and obviously that, God's involved in those special moments in a massive way. But it was at the end of John Lennox preaching so effectively, you just thought, wow, this was for us. I don't want to lose this moment. And to be in a room with hundreds of people who are all feeling probably that same thing. I don't want to lose this. Yeah. It was beautiful.
In terms of landing messages, we're thinking be aware and be deliberate about language you're using. So, like I say, if you're speaking to youth, if you're speaking to whoever you're speaking to, just be aware of the language, make it relevant language, relevant illustrations, and certainly kind of where you're, like the venues of application certainly need to be relevant.
And hitting the right level as well.
Yeah.
And don't be tempted. I've felt this myself, preaching in a church, visiting a church, and I knew that there were two people there that were visiting, but seminary professors. Okay. One of whom I have his book, on my shelf. He's world-renowned Old Testament scholar, or whatever, and he sat at the back, and you feel it inside. I've got to impress.
Right.
I've got to aim for those two. And I spotted that, prayed about it before I preached. Lord, there's a lot of people here that aren't those two. Help me to preach to the people who are here, not just try to show off for the whoever, the professor in the room. And so I preached for the congregation as I knew it. These were visitors, doesn't matter, And actually both of them were really warm, really grateful, But I think if I had tried to impress them, there would have been 200 other people going, well, what's he doing? Yeah. He's lost me. He's not normally like this.
Yeah.
And so, preach to the people in the room, but don't be swayed too much by an outlier. If you happen to have a Bible scholar or a Bible translator or somebody that intimidates you as a Christian, don't try to impress them. Preach to the people that are there. Yeah. John Stott, I just mentioned this. I'm sort of assuming this, even as we use the phrase land it. But John Stott, in his book, Between Two Worlds, back, was that 1982? It was a classic book. He talks about how the preacher stands between the world of the Bible and the world of the listener. And he says that sometimes, or often, conservative evangelical Bible people like us will start in the world of the Bible and then just build a tower straight up to heaven. As if, that's the destination, that's the goal, that's the whole thing, but they don't land in the world of the listener. Whereas more liberal, people that don't really see God at work in and behind the Bible and so on, they'll start in a very contemporary way and just build there and never land it back in the world of the Bible. And that's where we're getting the idea of land it. We stand between these two worlds, and we want to make sure that we are in the world of the Bible, thoroughly understanding it as best we can, and then landing it in the world of our listeners, understanding them as best we can. And if the best you can do is a passing reference to a predominant workplace, it's better than nothing. But if you know the people, if you can land it, in specific ways, get a feel for the church. If you're a leader, we're talking about this, that preaching as a leader, you can kind of say that this is where we want to go as a church, and people are following that. That's good preaching. But as a guest speaker, maybe all you can do is offer them something as a gift from the Bible. But if you can make it look like it's wrapped for them and, to them, that's better than here's a generic gift.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what we mean by land it. I hope we got that across. But just a little biblical support for that as we finish. My mind immediately went to the book of Acts. And I love, as you go through the book of Acts, how Paul is seen preaching in different settings, and he's on target. He knows his audience in the different settings where he preaches. So in Acts 13, he's in Pisidian Antioch in the synagogue, and you've got an Old Testament rich sermon. But then he comes to Lystra in Acts 14, and this is the first genuinely non-Jewish infiltrated town, if you like, on the first missionary journey. And you look at how Paul preaches to them. Remember, they came out trying to worship Paul and Barnabas as if they were Hermes and Zeus, which I'd love to watch the video. I think that would have been fascinating to see their faces at that moment. But But they tore their garments, they rushed into the crowd. This is verse 14. Verse 15, men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you. We bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. And so he goes on for a couple more verses, presenting the gospel, but in language that they could understand. He didn't try to, not impress even, but he didn't try to assume that they would follow with Old Testament quotations. He's giving them Old Testament truth, but he's not giving them quotation upon quotation upon quotation. And the same thing in Acts 17, when Paul comes to Athens and he speaks to the men of the Areopagus, he quotes their prophets, their poets, and he gives biblical truth, but he's not relying on Old Testament quotes that aren't going to register. Back in the synagogue, or even with Christians in Acts 20, Paul preaches to the people that are stood in front of him. It's not like Paul had one message that he just rolled out time and time and time again, whatever conference he was invited to, without an awareness of his listeners. And that's a good example for us. And so whether you're preaching in your own church next Sunday, or whether you're invited to speak in another church, at a funeral, at a conference, whatever the setting, you want to preach what the text says. You want to be faithful to the word of God and communicate that as effectively as you possibly can. But part of that effective communication is to land it. Do whatever you can, pray and discover and research and ask questions, get to know who you're going to be preaching to, and then land it.
Yeah, it's great that we can be confident that God speaks to all of us, all the types of us. And we can trust him and his spirit to work in all of us, listen to preaching. So that's us for this episode. We're grateful again for you listening and joining us, and we will be with you again soon.
Thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate every positive review, like, share, and comment. And thank you for praying for us. We hope you will join us again next time on the Biblical Preaching Podcast.